Andrea, thank you so much for taking time to come on the GeoTrek podcast.
You're welcome. It's nice to be here.
It's great to talk to you because you work in this really interesting intersection between insurance and real estate and a lot of these hot topics right now that people are talking about, especially in the state of Florida where you live. Could you share a little bit about the perspective on the big picture of how insurance carriers may look at risk in the state of Florida? I know you live there, you work there, you have a lot of interesting insights on this topic.
Thank you. And I do think that it's very interesting. And one thing about insurance, especially being in Southwest Florida, is that it is ever changing. And I'll just refer back to pre-Hurricane Ian. I mean, the markets were already concerned about wind and flood exposure, already becoming very conservative, experiencing some financial strain. And we were seeing that on the insurance side as far as capacity and rates. And then post Ian, it's a market I've never seen before. So, I mean, the big picture as far as what we're seeing right now post Ian is that a lot of carriers did not open up after the storm. There's a lot of reluctance to write in Florida. There are still a lot of unknowns as far as what kind of catastrophic claims the carriers are expected to see. There's a lot of speculation there, but overall and in general, I mean, carriers are wanting to, and have been for the last decade or two, really monitoring wind and flood exposure, and they use cat modeling. A lot of sophisticated underwriters will use wind and cat modeling to determine are they interested in insuring a particular property, and the likelihood that property is of sustaining damage after a storm. So, I mean, the conversation has been there, and yeah, I mean, obviously, it's continuing to evolve.
Yeah, Andrea, so Ian comes, a lot of people don't realize how densely populated that area near Cape Coral, Fort Myers, down to Naples. I mean, a lot of people got hit by this storm. So when you said that it's volatile, people are talking about, with a lot of question marks and maybe uncertainty about what insurance will look like. What are some of the factors that people consider post Ian?
So, I mean, right now, post Ian, it's mostly around, the conversation is around claims, rebuilding. So I don't know that really consumers have gotten past that aspect of their experience to really think about what is the insurance market going to look like down the road. I mean, there certainly are no shortage of families that still want to move to Florida, and I'm surprised at the number of new business submissions that I've been getting. So it is true that homeowners still want to move to Florida, and I think that consumers are finding out in that space that there are very, very few insurance products that are available right now.
That's really interesting. So it sounds like some of this even started before Ian. I mean, which is really interesting because in a way, from a climatological perspective, Florida's been quite lucky. There have been some really catastrophic storms that were near misses. Like several years ago, Hurricane Dorian was a Cat 5 hurricane just stalled out in the western Bahamas, not that far east from Fort Lauderdale and West Palm Beach. And there were a lot of close calls like this in recent years. So I was surprised to hear some different industry professionals say, even despite a lot of the near misses, Florida insurance was, I don't know if I want to use the word precarious, but there were a lot of challenges for carriers writing in Florida even before Ian. Could you share about what some of those challenges have been?
So there was a time in the not so distant past where Florida insurance was profitable. As you said, we were lucky. We had a lot of near misses, and I cannot tell you how many times that happened where, every single year we'd have a number of storms, hurricane watch or warning approaching, and it would go by, and it was a non-event year after year after year. And, after Hurricane Andrew, a lot of things happened after Hurricane Andrew, but we were definitely in an upcycle where rates were continuing to go up. Carriers were finding the marketplace profitable and writing business. So it was, the market was good. A lot of carriers had come into the state willing to write new policies, and then Hurricane Irma. So Hurricane Irma actually pivoted the market just a few years back. We were just to the 5-year mark after Irma, and that really changed, I think, carriers' willingness to want to write in Florida, both from a hurricane claim filing standpoint and from a litigation standpoint. So it was from Irma where we saw so many attorney fees come up as part of the insurance cost. And in Florida has 8% of the claims nationally, but we have 80% of the litigation. And so there's been some reform around that to try to resolve some of those issues so that we have a healthier insurance market moving forward. And I think it's critical, for the real estate market, for the economy, to have a healthy, sustainable insurance market. Now that was all pre-Ian, so so we were already struggling with carriers' financial strength prior to Hurricane Ian, and I really think that is why, since this last storm, which was obviously incredibly devastating, the marketplace just has not reopened.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And Andrea, you really have a deep knowledge there of these different storms, how that changed insurance. Could we even go chronologically? Like, we know Florida had this really hyperactive time of hurricane history in the 20s, the 40s, the 50s. Then like the 70s, 80s were really quiet, and there was explosive growth in the state during those years. There were actually no major hurricanes in South Florida in the 70s or 80s. Then in 92, Hurricane Andrew hits especially the southern part of Metro Miami as a Cat 5 hurricane. Could we kind of chronologically go into how things changed with Andrew and then kind of follow that through the time between Andrew and Irma and then talk about Irma? So, I mean, what happened with Andrew in 92? How did that change insurance in the market?
So those were my early insurance days, but I certainly was a Floridian at that stage. And it is my recollection that Andrew was more of a wind event. Prior to Andrew, the insurance marketplace was extremely robust. I mean, we had multitude of AM best rated carriers that were writing in Florida, and the rates were really competitive. I mean, they were comparable to any other place in the country. So the Andrew occurred, it primarily hit the East Coast. It's my recollection that was primarily a wind event, which affects the homeowner insurance versus a flood. Here on the southwest side of South Florida, we had a few claims, but nothing like what they experienced on the East Coast. And after Andrew, and it took a few years, but systematically, one carrier after another pulled out of Florida until we were left with primarily writing with Citizens, which was the state pool, and excess surplus lines. That was when really the reinsurance market became much more prevalent in Florida, where carriers were more heavily relying on reinsurance companies. And so, we eventually got back on course with the help of the reinsurance markets. As I said, we were writing with Citizens and Lloyd's of London, but then a lot of Florida domicile Demotech rated carriers started to emerge, and all of those, which again are Florida domiciles, so they're only writing in Florida, which is a cat state, were supported by the reinsurance market. And at the time, the reinsurance carriers were happy to do it. They thought Florida was going to be profitable, and it was for many years. So we went from Andrew to, I want to say the next storm that was memorable to me was around the time of Wilma. Florida has had a lot of storms.
Yeah, 2004, we had those 4 hurricane strikes, especially remember Francis and Jean back to back on the East Coast. We had Charlie in the Southwest. We had Ivan in the Panhandle. I think that was another year where people's eyes were open. I have a question for, you said people got a little bit nervous with writing in Florida as far as wind exposure after Andrew. Was it a matter of how many wind claims that Andrew actually inflicted, or was it just the concept, because you got to Fort Lauderdale and north, there weren't that many wind claims. There wasn't that much in Southwest Florida. With Andrew, was it the actual amount of losses and the actual amount of claims, or was it more the concept hey, a Cat 5 hurricane could also hit Fort Lauderdale, Fort Myers, all these other places? Was it more conceptual or actual losses?
I think that some of the primary factors were that the policies were not rate adequate. So carriers lost a ton of money after Andrew. They weren't getting enough rate. And in order for them to get proper rate, buildings had to be hardened, so that the devastation that occurred because of the building codes in force at that time were catastrophic, and carriers weren't getting enough rate, properties were underinsured. The property language at the time had guaranteed replacement costs, so even though somebody was underinsured, they were still getting their house rebuilt to what it would cost at that, what it would cost in real time for that home to be rebuilt. So, and what happens in that standard market is that a carrier can't just go to the state and file for a $300% rate increase. So carriers probably weren't able to get the rate that they needed to stay in Florida. They didn't think it was going to be profitable, so many of them pulled out.
When you say that the carriers couldn't get the rate increase, do you mean like if someone had a house that was valued at $200,000 during Andrew, but then the cost of rebuild was way more than that? Is it that the insurance is responsible to pay for that increased value, but they almost like they're in a loss, right? Because they're responsible to make people whole, but they can't necessarily jack up the rates all of a sudden.
Right. And every contract is different, but there were some contracts at the time. So it was standard practice in Florida to write a homeowner policy with what you think is the dwelling replacement cost at the time that you're writing the policy, but then there's a clause in there that guarantees the home will be rebuilt the way that it stands now in the event of a claim. That policy language is only a few carriers are doing that, and they're very, very particular about making sure that the homes are valued properly, where they'd come out and do an inspection. But the majority of the carriers are not using that policy language anymore. Sometimes you can get a little bit of extra coverage, but the percentage is usually capped to like maybe 25% if you're lucky. But
yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And like you said, I think it sounds like the carriers got nervous about not only the meteorological side of the wind exposure, but the quality of construction, just how many assets, the amount of assets in harm's way, right? I think at that time in 92, we started seeing the South Florida building code really change post Andrew, right? I
did. Yes, so I think there was a lot of restructuring after Andrew, both from a building code standpoint, and then all of these, Demotech rated carriers that were coming into Florida, basically a restructuring on, the Florida insurance marketplace, because those are the carriers, those Demotech rated carriers insured the majority of properties, over the course of the next few decades.
Andrea, could you explain what you mean by Demotech?
Yeah, it's a financial stability rating company that we rely on in Florida to rate insurance carriers, because carriers that write just in Florida would otherwise not receive a favorable AM Best rating, so they rely on Demotech.
I see what you're saying. So that's really just within the state, and they need to have kind of rating within the state. Is some of the concern there? I know a lot of carriers like to have geographic diversification where they're writing in a whole bunch of different places. So if there's a catastrophe in one area, they don't go under. Is some of the concern for people that just write in Florida that they may be taking on too much Florida risk?
Yes, and I think that carriers, even though they're Florida based, will still try to write, not everything on the coast. They might want to write maybe more business in Central Florida, and they usually diversify by writing, other lines of business, maybe umbrella policies, valuable articles. I mean, there's not a lot of diversification there. So, property insurance markets that are Demotech rated are real, they're the most exposed. I mean, there's no other way. They're the most exposed. They rely on the reinsurance markets, and they're the most volatile.
Andrea, so what did insurance look like in Florida from Andrew to Irma? I mean, was it changing through that time? I know we did have the active years of 2004, 2005. Were things changing a lot, or were they pretty stable? Markets were, carriers were in and out of the market somewhat. I mean, the market was somewhat stable. I definitely noticed a trend with new carriers emerging, especially in the high net worth space, which is where I primarily focus. And I think there was a good stretch of time where Florida was profitable, so more carriers wanted to get into the Florida business. But it's interesting because even before Irma, but especially after Irma, I want to say, I really started hearing underwriters' concern around flood exposure. And that was really the first time I saw or heard,
this sort of undertone of, it seemed to me that carriers were aware that we were due for a flood event, which is what we just experienced. So I'm not entirely surprised of this storm and the devastation that it caused, but at the same time, were the carriers prepared? That's what I'm wondering. Were the carriers prepared, because they're the ones that are going to have to, sustain all these claims that are coming in.
You talked before about cat modeling when carriers were inferring and implying that they had concern about flood risk. Was that more on the coast? Was it more inland rainfall flood?
Coastal. I mean, but some of these conversations with underwriters, it's interesting how, anyone in a flood zone, there was always a lot of scrutiny around it, and particularly the coastal areas. In fact, the county where I live, they went from a zero elevation requirement, so homes had to be built to a zero elevation requirement, which every area has a flood zone and a base flood elevation requirement. So historically, they had to be built, to at least that base flood elevation requirement. And then our city, which is where all the coastal properties lie, came in not that long ago, maybe 4 years ago, and said they wanted the new properties had to be built to a +1. So I know that. I forgot what the question was.
Yeah, really talking about that difference between coastal flood and inland. It sounds like you're saying coastal flood really got on the radar.
Yeah, so the carriers are definitely, so the flood maps and the county also were aware of the flood exposure, and the carriers have been aware of it. And it always seemed to be wanting more than what the building code supported. So yeah, the carriers have been aware of these coastal exposures. Were they still writing coastal properties? Yes. Mostly newer builds. Everything, anything newer has hurricane impact windows. They always looked at the elevation, and they found some that I guess modeled well wind, based on the wind and the flood cat modeling, and they thought they could get enough rate to support that risk.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Andrea, you mentioned how the carriers wanted, obviously less exposure, less risk, higher elevations, better built buildings. Were there times where really what they're wanting is beyond the building or the elevation code?
Well, yes, because I would say that some of the guidelines would say they wanted to build, technically they wanted something at a +2 elevation difference. And it's very, very rare to have a house like that. So if all the other factors in the account were favorable, there was a good spread of risk. They usually, in the insurance market, a lot of the preferred carriers will pick up the wind exposure in Florida if they can balance that with an out-of-state property. So they want a cat to non-cat balance. So if all the other factors in the account were favorable, and there was just this one thing where, it's only built to a +1 instead of a +2, a lot of times they would approve those.
I see. So they're kind of looking at this risk. They're trying to spread out the risk. They're trying to basically look at this in the context of the big picture of what they're writing and what kind of exposure they have.
Correct.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Andrea, we had talked before we recorded this podcast about how I thought it was really interesting how carriers may only want to cover houses with, say, newer roofs, but there may be regulation requiring them to take a roof that's slightly older. Could you share a little bit about that perspective?
Yes, and this is pre-Hurricane Ian. There's definitely a trend in the marketplace for carriers not to want to write older properties or homes with older roofs. And I think a lot of that goes back to the fact that we had Irma, and Irma went over top a lot of these houses, and even if they didn't have a roof claim, there was still that intense wind event that passed over this particular house. So, and I think, my personal opinion is that the roof can only sustain so many of those events. So, you've got these carriers that are still trying to be profitable to some extent, need to be able to buy affordable reinsurance. And I think the push on that was really coming from the reinsurance market. So reinsurance carriers only really wanting to allocate capacity to carriers that are more selective, that have a better selection process as far as the new business that they're taking on, ones that are going to sustain a storm more effectively, where they're not, the roof isn't going to come off after, as a result of the wind. So that was pre-Ian.
That's really interesting. So it sounds like you're saying reinsurance was more favorable to want to partner with insurance companies that are being more selective, that are not just insuring any old house, but saying, oh, we're pretty selective in maybe the age of the roof or different structural elements.
Right. The carriers were trying to manage their exposure so that they could sustain their financial stability rating and have long-term financial strength. But it was really causing a big hardship for homeowners because a home could still have a good amount of roof life left. So the state stepped in earlier this year and created some reform around that. So now, and I'm seeing some of that become activated, where the state is saying that an insurer cannot refuse to renew or refuse to renew a home with a roof that is 15 years or newer. So the carriers are not allowed to, restrict writing new accounts or limit their renewals to homes that are where the roof is only 10 years old. They have to go up to 15.
So if my roof is 12 years old, they can't say we're going to deny your insurance because of that factor. You're saying with that?
They would have to have another reason.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So that's in a way helping some homeowners get more affordable insurance, whereas maybe the carriers themselves may prefer to almost drop those off if they could.
Right, because it's, ideally, I think part of being able to move forward successfully after this latest, devastating hurricane is that Floridians can maintain their insurance with the carriers that they're with. I mean, hopefully these carriers are going to exhibit, financial stability, and because that's where the most competitive insurance pricing is going to be. Anybody new into the market, I'm sure the rates are going to be higher. I mean, there could be an exception to that rule, but for the most part, best thing to do is to try to stay with your current insurer. And the conversation has really been around risk management, making sure that the roof is properly maintained, making sure that if it is showing signs of age, that the homeowner is replacing it in a timely manner so that it can properly sustain, hurricane force winds that, could very well be right around the corner.
Andrea, I'm really glad that you mentioned some things that homeowners can do to get out ahead of this, prepare themselves. It sounds like maintaining that roof is a big thing that they can do. Are there other factors that they can do with their home, their business, their condo, whatever it is, to kind of help them be, hopefully get more favorable insurance opportunities?
There definitely are. And I think the conversation around this has been to prevent claims. So to address situations that could prevent a claim before it occurs, because having claims activity, unfortunately, is a criteria, and carriers may not be as willing to insure somebody who has had, a robust claims history. But things around, I mean, when we're talking about hurricanes, so in addition to maintaining the roof, hardening the home with high impact windows and doors, I mean, that was part of the building code reform a couple decades ago that has really helped Floridians and the marketplace. So hurricane impact windows and doors, but then also too, one of the other big causes of loss that a lot of people don't talk about, it's not as glamorous, are water losses. So inside water, where all these homes and all these pipes are getting older. So homes are getting older, pipes are leaking, electrical systems malfunction, and a lot of interior water losses. So installing a water leak detection system, replacing things like your water supply line, and then having making sure your plumbing systems are all up to date. Those are some really key factors.
Well, and Andrea, those things don't really necessarily need a storm for there to be a crisis in your home, right?
Exactly. But you're still displaced, and it's claims activity, and it's, it weighs on the carrier's financial stability, and and also too, from a consumer standpoint, your ability to get insurance, or that house's ability to be insured moving forward, because the claim not only follows the homeowner, it also follows the home. So
yeah, that's very interesting. Andrea, so do carriers have the autonomy to select someone that they want to cover or not? Like, are they regulated that they have to cover certain kinds of people? Like, in other words, if I came and my roof is so many years old and there's certain criteria, but maybe there have been multiple claims on that house, can they arbitrarily just say, no, we're going to choose not to insure you? Do they have that autonomy?
They have guidelines in place, and it could be based on number of losses. It could be based on, there's so many differentiating factors. Prior claims are a big one, age of the home, and distance to the water. There are just so many factors that determine the eligibility. So if the risk meets all the eligibility guidelines, then usually we can get an account written. So there's not an I don't usually see underwriters decline to write business when it meets all the underwriting guidelines and everything is in place as per their standards.
I see what you're saying, that they know, they kind of have a system to evaluate what's going to be profitable, what they want to do business with and not. And so if you fall in those categories that they want to do business in, they're pretty much going to write business with you.
Right. And then there are always going to be some gray areas. Like, for example, I'm working on an account where there's a Tesla shingle roof that's solar, and not everyone is familiar with the Tesla shingle roof, or are they comfortable? So there are always going to be some things that are outside the guidelines, and that's left up to underwriting discretion.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. It's very interesting, these details of the market. I think a lot of our listeners are going to be excited to learn about this. I had another question. We talked about the litigation. You said 8% of the national claims, 80% of the national litigation coming with in the state of Florida. Is that litigation usually tied to a catastrophe, or is it just kind of nonstop around the year?
I think that it is. Well, I saw it very much tied to the catastrophe because of the whole roof conversation. And it was interesting because after Hurricane Irma, when you looking at neighborhoods or looking at houses and just peering up at the roof, a lot of these roofs appeared to be fine. But once you got up there and you could see that there was some structural damage, there was just a lot of conversation whether is it a repair or is it a replacement. The late claim filings, there were a lot of things that were catastrophe driven that encouraged the litigation problems that we experienced. But are there I think there are litigation concerns even outside of a cat loss. I think that it's been a trend. So I think that
Sure.
Because it's been a trend, it's I think there's consumers might much more quickly want to combat a declination, a claim declination, versus accept the fact that some things aren't covered. And actually, that is what we're seeing. I'm not saying the litigation part of it, but I am, definitely seeing a good portion of the claims that are filed recently from Hurricane Ian, things that aren't covered. I think, and maybe it's just it's more of an awareness piece that consumers become aware of things that they cannot insure for, because you cannot insure for everything. Things like additional living expenses if your home is flooded. There are a lot of exclusions in the policy that relate to flood. And so I don't, I think as much, from an agent point of view, as much as you try to educate your clients on that, there's only a certain amount that they're going to retain. And frankly, had they known that these are the limitations on the insurance side, would they still have purchased the property? I think they would. So I do think there's an education element there.
Sure. And Andrea, let's talk about that. You work at a really interesting interface. You're so knowledgeable with insurance, but then you're working a lot with the real estate market, educating and training realtors. So what does that look like? What are the kinds of questions you get from realtors as far as, just training them, educating them in this whole field?
Right. So I've always sort of positioned myself with the realtors from a place of support, providing support to help field those questions on the insurance side. There are always a lot of questions about flood. Is this in a flood zone? What does the insurance look like? So on and so forth. And and now more than ever, a lot of questions on the realtor side as far as, is my client going to be able to buy affordable insurance? So on the education side right now, I would say right now, post Ian, it is, I think it is around, for me, it has been around, providing a realistic expectation of what the market is looking like right now, when it is expected to change, and why it's not changing faster. So I think that, as a professional, I like to be completely transparent, and I think that it's really important to have a healthy, sustainable market moving forward. I mean, insurance is the underpinning of the real estate market, and real estate is, a gigantic element in our economy here in Florida. So it's essential that the real estate market, has the support that it needs to be able to, to attract folks to Florida. And I think folks still want to come to Florida, but they do want to transfer. I think for the most part, homeowners want a risk transfer. They don't want to absorb the loss entirely if they're devastated by a hurricane. They want to be able to buy proper coverage. So are the products there for them? I don't know. I don't know what the answer to that is, because we're still waiting to see what the reinsurance markets are going to do.
So, and some of this is getting into market volatility after Ian, right? So, like, what kind of questions are you getting from realtors right now? Are they wanting to know, like, getting into next calendar year, what kind of products will be available? Will their clients be able to get insurance? Those types of things.
More so, I would say a good number of realtors have reached out to me in the last couple of weeks saying, I have a listing, I have a buyer, we're under contract. Is it true that there's a moratorium? Yes. There are a few carriers that are writing. Do you have something for this particular client? I've been shopping the market on a couple of different ones. I've had to, in the last couple of weeks, deliver the news that I had no market, or if I have no market, this is why. There's existing damage. It has to be remediated. The repairs have to be made. There's an open claim. No one's, for the most part, no one's going to want to write a piece of property with an open loss. So it's been more like deals in the immediate future that realtors have been mostly concerned about. I don't know how far ahead they're thinking as far as what the market is going to look like later. I think that seems to be a bit of a pause that folks are taking to do the water remediation that needs to happen and do the rebuild that needs to happen. But still, at the same time, and I think it's coming from homeowners and condo unit owners who had made a decision that this is they're going to be moving to Florida. Maybe they sold their house up north. They already have, a plan in mind as far as how they want to, they're moving to Florida and this is the house they're under contract with. And so where do we move forward from here? I did have one deal that I was getting ready to bind where the homeowner ended up not doing it. But, I definitely think that there are delays on the real estate side where, where it's written into the contract, they have more time for buyers and sellers to decide what they're going to do. So
yeah, sure.
They're not under tremendous pressure to make a decision immediately. But I think that realtors are for the most part concerned about long-term, long-term insurability. I think we all are. So realtors, insurance professionals like myself, and just homeowners in general.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And it's interesting, too, to talk to you because you work a lot in the Naples area. So I know I rode out Ian in the Punta Gorda to Fort Myers area. There was a lot of water and wind damage. From my understanding, Naples tended to be more on the flood side, more on the water side. Did that change how all this plays out in a place like Naples, where maybe you did not get as much wind impacts, but you got a lot of flooding?
We did, yes. So I think it will. I mean, in our area, when you look at the magnitude of the claims that we're handling, they are all water events, with the exception of automobiles that were flooded. So that's all property. That's covered under the auto policy. But majority are flood related. I've had a few wind claims. Mostly the wind claims that I've been working on have been further north. As you said, it's more of a wind event there. However, anytime there's a catastrophe in the state of Florida that is a wind event, it affects all Floridians. So even though, I can sit here and say, well, I didn't have a wind claim on my house, and it's true, but other people did, and so it's going to affect the market, and it's going to affect every one of us and our policies.
Oh, so you could be maybe up in Tampa, and all of a sudden your premium on wind insurance may go up, and you may say, I didn't have a wind claim. No one in my zip code had a wind claim, but because it was absorbed somewhere in the state, that's going to affect everyone's premium.
Right, because even they use different demographics, and it'll be closer to the water, rates are higher. Further away from the water, rates are lower. But same criteria: age of the home, whether it's masonry or concrete block. Does that house have hurricane impact shutters? So there'll be all the same underwriting factors that it would apply to any county.
Andrea, here's a question. I hope I can express this clearly. Let's say I live in Fort Myers and I had a fortified house built really well. I actually did not have any wind damage sustained, right? And also, I'm elevated above the floodwaters of Ian. So I also did not flood. So I didn't flood. I had no wind damage. Am I going to absorb an increased premium because other people, took a hit and we need to spread out that loss? Or on the flip side, could I say, hey, look, I just took a hit from a Cat 4 hurricane and have no damage to my property because it's built so well, I deserve a discount?
Okay, so standard markets, like, all the standard markets, these DemoTech rated carriers that we're talking about, the preferred package markets, I'm talking about carriers like Chubb, Pure, AIG, Cincinnati, Berkeley One, Vault Insurance. All their rates are filed through the Florida Department of Insurance. So for there to be a rate increase, they have to produce actuarials, which means that they have to demonstrate, there were this number of wind claims that resulted in loss, and I need to take rate in this area. So all of that doesn't happen overnight. So they would have to file with the Florida Department of Insurance to get a rate increase. And then yes, if that is all true, then we should expect rates to go up. But when you get into the excess surplus lines, like Lloyd's of London type markets, they react much more quickly. So right after a storm, a Lloyd's, or I'll just say QBE Insurance, I can't think of all the different there are many Lloyd's of London syndicates. They're going to raise their rates a lot more quickly based on the probability that there is going to be another storm. I mean, the fact that that home is built exceptionally well and it's properly elevated, I hope that there'll be a number of carriers who would be interested in writing that home. I mean, that's sort of the insurance landscape that we'd experienced in the past, where a homeowner that built their home exceptionally well would have a choice in the marketplace as to which carrier would they wanted to go with. I don't know if we're going to have that luxury in the future, and so because we may not have the choices we've had in the past, that homeowner may pay more as well. So it could be rates have to be filed through the Florida Department of Insurance. Any standard markets have to comply with that. But then there's also the capacity issue that fewer options usually drives the rate up. A healthy market is where carriers, there's more carriers that want to come into the Florida marketplace, and that selection process drives rates down. So we probably won't be in that type of a market for a while.
That's really interesting. Andrea, I love just soaking in your knowledge with all this stuff. These are questions I'm getting. A lot of times my background's more in meteorology and climatology, so this is great to learn from you about how these markets work, how the carriers think, how insurance and reinsurance plays out. Before we close out on this podcast, I wanted to shift the focus a little bit away from Florida to other states, how Florida might be different than other areas, and actually how I found you. We just passed the 10-year anniversary for Superstorm Sandy, and the reason I say Superstorm Sandy instead of Hurricane Sandy, it was a very complex storm. It was a hurricane really passing by the east coast of Florida. It was a hurricane when it passed by North Carolina, so there were a lot of hurricane claims in the southeastern U.S., but right before Sandy made landfall in New Jersey, it was officially classified not a hurricane anymore. And sometimes people say, I was just reading the National Hurricane Center report. They think that it actually did produce hurricane force winds, but it was no longer a tropical cyclone. It became what we call extratropical. It lost some of its tropical characteristics. And a lot of people say, well, who cares? My house took on wind and flood damage. Who cares what you call it? But I found this article that you had written where it actually does make a difference for homeowners and their insurance policies depending on the classification of how the storm is classified. Could you share a little bit about that?
Absolutely. I found that event very interesting because, 10 years ago, we were still, educating homeowners about how a hurricane deductible works. That is something that was rolled onto homeowner policies. It was post Andrew. And yes, when it's a hurricane, at least the trigger in Florida, every state has a different trigger. So the trigger in Florida is when there's a hurricane watch or warning that's issued by the National Hurricane Center anywhere in the state. Then the hurricane deductible is activated. So it's a percentage of your dwelling coverage limit versus your all other perils deductible. So that story I thought was very interesting because folks in North Carolina were faced with the hurricane deductible versus folks in New Jersey had their all perils deductible. So they had a much smaller out-of-pocket expense, which was very good for homeowners in that area who probably were completely not prepared for that storm. So, but it was a really good way of illustrating how the hurricane deductible works.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So it sounds like you're saying for especially hurricane-prone states, catastrophe states, a hurricane deductible means if it was classified as a hurricane, really whether or not your home faced hurricane force winds, just if it was classified by the Hurricane Center as a hurricane, then you have to pay that hurricane deductible. Yeah, very interesting. And I thought it was fascinating that Sandy actually was producing hurricane force winds, but just before landfall in New Jersey, it was no longer officially a hurricane. That reduced that deductible for a lot of homeowners. Andrea, really appreciate your insights. Do you have any last insights, any last perspectives to share with our listeners just on this whole topic? I know you cover a wide range of expertise professionally. Any last thoughts or insights?
I have, as I said, when we first started talking, the insurance marketplace has been, changes dramatically. It has over the course of my, say, 30-year tenure. And, we are definitely getting into this space where the conversation is more around risk management. And I just invite homeowners to consider that in terms of making sure that their homes are maintained exceptionally well and doing everything that they can on the consumer side to prevent a claim, to confirm that all of their systems are up to date, because I think that affects all Floridians. And I'm a citizen here as well and a policyholder, and I plan on spending my retirement in Florida. So I want to be able to, I just think it's very important to me to have a healthy economy, to have a healthy insurance environment, and I do think it's going to take all of us as responsible homeowners to get to where we need to be.
Andrea, for your homeowners that heard you say that and say, okay, what can I do to take actions to better prepare my property, to better maintain my space, my belongings, my home? Are there workshops they can go to? Are there things they can find online? Like how can people find you online? Or are there seminars? Are there webinars? What resources out there could help guide people to make these better decisions?
Yeah, and I think that one of the things that we could do better, especially with the flooding event that we know that occurred, there's been a lot of conversation around having hurricane evacuation plans for their cars. And I mean, that has actually been a conversation for a few years. But the problem had been that there really wasn't a solid solution. I mean, where could homeowners relocate their cars? How can we make sure that all these cars are not going to be flooded? So there will definitely be more conversation around that. I know that as an agency, we're going to be putting together some directive material for our clients to help them protect their vehicles. But on the property side also, you can always move your personal property upstairs. So, I mean, that's just something that probably didn't occur as many times this time as it could have, from this storm as it could have. But workshops and events where folks can learn, I mean, I'll have to research that.
Okay.
Yeah, I'll have to research that.
Yeah, it seems from the time I spent on the ground before, during, and after Ian, I got the sense people thought, wow, this is real stuff. Like people that actually went through a catastrophe like that got flooded, that had wind damage. I sense that people want to better prepare, that they want to learn better about risk. I think a lot of people felt a little bit maybe flat-footed, or like they weren't really thinking this was going to happen because maybe previous storms had missed them, and maybe a little bit complacent. And now I think is a good time where people are going to be hungry for education and do some things to better prepare themselves and their property.
Absolutely.
Andrea, we were talking a little bit about this deep, hyperactive hurricane history in Florida, like the 20s, the 40s, the 50s, up through the mid-60s, very hyperactive. In fact, I just got into the hurricane climatology of South Florida. In the past 50 years, there have been 6 major hurricanes in South Florida. That's 1973 to 2022, 6 major hurricanes. The 50 years before that, there were 12. There were twice as many. So, in fact, even from 1945 to 1950, there's a 6-year period with 5 major hurricanes. If you repeated it today, I mean, it would just be devastating to South Florida. Do you think people are aware of this deeper history in the region, or do you think they're not as aware of that?
I think they are not aware of that at all. In fact, I was not aware of it until you shared that data with me when we first started talking, because I always look at weather patterns as in cycles, but smaller cycles. And so you're looking at the bigger cycles, and I'm looking at the smaller cycles within the bigger cycles. I think that one of the reasons that we, and I'll say just Neapolitans, Floridians, haven't gone back to look at that long-standing history is because it's not. It was pre-modern Naples or pre-modern Florida. So, but I think that's really important information because we know that history always repeats itself, and that it does help us prepare for what's to come.
When I've looked at the demographics in the region, the 70s and 80s have this explosive growth. So I think a lot of people have lived there for 50 years. And if their baseline was the 70s and 80s, if they think that was normal, 2 decades when there were no major hurricanes, all of a sudden we have had some powerful storms in recent decades, Andrew and Irma and others, but they've been, pretty infrequent compared to, say, the 40s and 50s. So if your baseline is a time of tranquility, all of a sudden a storm like Ian, people are shocked, or they're thinking it must be climate change. The deeper history kind of tells a bit of a different story, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. And, a lot of these flood zones are AE flood zones, and we had not experienced a devastating flood event like we did in Hurricane Ian since Hurricane Donna, which was in the 50s. So these AE flood zones, the prediction is that every 100 years they're going to flood, and Hurricane Ian hit, say, at the 70-year mark. So we were really due for a flood in this area. So it does make me wonder if the insurance carriers were aware of that, were carriers predicting that there was going to be a flood coming, which would have sort of supported the apprehension that we had been seeing in the market last few years on wanting to write properties in coastal areas. So I think it all does go back to the history, and it's a science, and I'm so glad someone is researching that.
Andrea, thanks a lot. I always hope you get a period of tranquility and recovery down there, but it's good to be aware of our history, especially when there have been a lot of catastrophic hurricanes. Andrea, really appreciate you taking time to come on the GeoTrek podcast. We're looking forward to following you in your career, and thank you so much for taking time to share your insights today.
My pleasure. I had a good time. Thank you for having me.
Thank you.